You're not standing at the edge of a new year. That's the first illusion that needs to dissolve. Calendars don't create transformation. Dates don't open portals. And time doesn't advance just because a number resets. If it did, everyone would evolve at once, and you already know that never happens. What's unfolding right now has nothing to do with January 1st. It has everything to do with where your consciousness has settled. From a quantum perspective, time isn't linear, it's contextual. Reality doesn't change because the clock moves forward. It changes because the observer does. When the observer stays the same, the year changes but life repeats. When the observer shifts, the timeline reorganizes, even if the calendar hasn't moved at all. That's why this moment feels different in a way you can't quite explain. It isn't excitement. It isn't fear. It isn't motivation. It's a quiet knowing that the old rhythm no longer fits. Nothing dramatic has ended on the surface, yet the urgency you once felt toward certain goals has softened. The identity you used to protect feels less solid. The future feels closer than the past, almost as if it's already leaning toward you. This isn't imagination. It isn't random intuition. It's a signal that your relationship with time is changing. Most people believe they enter a new year. In reality, they carry the same internal frequency forward and call it progress. But timelines don't respond to intention alone. They respond to coherence. And coherence isn't something you decide. It's something your system stabilizes into. Physics shows us that systems only shift states when their internal conditions change. You don't force a phase transition. You meet the conditions for it. Water doesn't boil because it wants to. It boils because its internal energy reaches a threshold. Consciousness works the same way. And right now, something within you has crossed that threshold. That's why the language of fresh starts no longer resonates. You're not wiping the slate clean. You're stepping out of a frequency that no longer responds to you. The timeline you've been living in has stopped feeding you information, emotion, and momentum, not because it failed, but because you outgrew its signal. And when a timeline stops responding, the mind panics. It calls it confusion. It calls it lack of direction. It calls it being stuck. But the field reads it differently. The field reads it as disengagement, decoupling, preparation for reassignment. Spiritually, this is the moment many traditions describe as the in-between, not the old world, not the new one yet. A suspension where identity loosens before it reforms. People often try to escape this phase by forcing clarity, forcing plans, forcing movement. But forcing movement inside a shifting timeline only creates drag. The truth is, you're not meant to move forward the way you used to. Neuroscience supports this more than most people realize. When identity is updating, the brain temporarily reduces motivation for old reward loops. The dopamine that once drove you toward familiar goals no longer fires the same way. This isn't depression, it's recalibration. The system is withdrawing energy from pathways that no longer match where you're going. That's why planning feels strange right now. You can still think about the future, but it feels hollow to plan it the old way. Vision boards don't land. Goals feel abstract. Hustle feels heavy. It's not because you lost ambition. It's because ambition tied to the old timeline no longer activates you. You're not starting a new year. You're exiting an old pattern of time. And this is where most people make the mistake of trying to drag the old self into the new timeline. They keep the same identity, the same emotional reactions, the same nervous system patterns, and wonder why the new year feels exactly like the last one. Timelines don't respond to hope. They respond to embodiment. The moment your internal state stabilizes into something different, reality reorganizes around it automatically. No effort, no declaration, no ceremony required. Just coherence. If you feel like something has already ended before it officially ends, if the old life feels distant even while you're still inside it, if the future feels present but undefined, That's not anxiety, that's not avoidance, that's not laziness. That's the sensation of a timeline loosening its grip. And in the next part, we're going to talk about why some people cross into new timelines without effort, while others repeat the same year under a different name. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to wake up one day in a completely different life, while others stay stuck repeating the same year with different dates on the calendar? From the outside, it looks like luck, timing, or privilege. But from the inside, and from the perspective of the quantum field, something much more precise is happening. Timelines don't change because someone tries harder. They change because someone stops emitting the frequency of the old one. This is where most people misunderstand manifestation. They believe reality responds to effort, intention, or willpower. But the quantum field doesn't read effort. It reads state. It responds to the internal coherence of the observer, to what is stable inside their nervous system, identity, and emotional baseline. When someone effortlessly enters a new timeline, it's not because they did less work. It's because the internal work is already complete. Their system no longer oscillates between wanting and doubting, hopping and forcing, trusting and controlling. The signal has stabilized. And once that happens, reality reorganizes itself automatically. Physics gives us a clean metaphor for this. When a system reaches a critical threshold, it doesn't slowly negotiate change. It snaps into a new state. Ice doesn't debate becoming water. It melts when the conditions are right. Consciousness behaves the same way. The people who seem to shift timelines without trying are not passive. They are coherent. Coherence means their thoughts, emotions, and identity are no longer pulling in different directions. What they want aligns with what they expect. What they expect aligns with how they behave. And how they behave aligns with how their nervous system feels on a daily basis. There's no internal argument happening anymore. Most people, on the other hand, live in contradiction. They desire one reality but emotionally prepare for another. They visualize abundance while bracing for disappointment. They talk about change while staying loyal to the identity built around struggle. The field doesn't respond to the words, it responds to the contradiction. This is why effort alone never produces a timeline shift. Effort without coherence amplifies friction. It keeps the system oscillating, and oscillation keeps probability from collapsing cleanly. Neuroscience explains this through prediction. The brain is constantly forecasting what it expects to happen next based on past patterns. If your emotional and physiological state still predicts struggle, delay, or instability, the brain will subtly steer your behavior in ways that recreate those outcomes, even while your conscious mind says it wants something different. The people who shift timelines don't think positive. They stop predicting the old future. That happens quietly, often unintentionally. After enough internal recalibration, the body no longer expects chaos as the default. Stress responses soften. Hypervigilance fades. The constant scanning for threats or validation stops. When the nervous system stops anticipating collapse, it stops recreating it. Spiritually, this is what it means to leave one state and enter another, not through affirmation, but through embodiment. Neville Goddard spoke about assuming the state of the wish fulfilled, but what's often missed is that this assumption must feel natural, and naturalness only comes when the old state has dissolved. You can't force naturalness. This is why some people don't even realize they've shifted timelines until they're already inside the new one. There's no ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet noticing that life responds differently now. Less resistance, cleaner timing, fewer emotional obstacles around progress. They didn't chase the new timeline. They stopped feeding the old one. And this is the part that can feel unsettling if you're in the middle of it right now. Because as you disengage from an old timeline, you temporarily lose its rewards. The motivations that once drove you disappear before new ones arrive. The identity that once defined you loosens before a new one stabilizes. From the outside, this looks like stagnation. From the inside, it feels like uncertainty, but from the field's perspective, it's precision. You are not meant to drag the old self into the new timeline. You are meant to let it dissolve so the transition can complete without distortion. The people who repeat the same year over and over aren't unlucky. They're loyal to the same internal frequency. And loyalty, when unconscious, is powerful. If you're noticing that the old ways of motivating yourself no longer work, if the old goals don't activate you, if effort feels misaligned instead of empowering, that's not failure. That's disengagement in progress. And in the next part, we're going to talk about the exact moment a timeline stops responding to you, and why that moment feels so strange, quiet, and unsettling before it becomes freeing. There is a precise moment in every real timeline shift where the old reality stops giving feedback, not dramatically, not with a collapse, but with silence. The signals you used to receive, motivation, urgency, emotional charge, even resistance, begin to fade. And when that happens, most people assume something is wrong. This is the most misunderstood phase of a quantum shift. A timeline doesn't end with chaos, it ends with irrelevance. The things that once pulled you forward or held you back simply stop working. Goals lose their emotional grip. Struggles stop feeling meaningful. Even desire changes tone. It's not gone, but it's quieter, less desperate, less attached to outcome. This can feel deeply unsettling because the human mind is conditioned to measure movement through emotion. When emotion disappears, the mind labels it as emptiness, confusion, or lack of direction. But from the perspective of the quantum field, this neutrality is not absence. It's disengagement. You are no longer being fed by the old timeline. In physics, when a system stops exchanging energy with its environment, it is no longer part of that system. It becomes isolated long enough to reorganize internally. Consciousness follows the same rule. When your emotional and neurological responses stop reinforcing a certain reality, that reality begins to dissolve. This is why forcing motivation during this phase never works. Motivation belongs to the old loop. It was built to move you forward inside a structure that no longer exists. Trying to resurrect it only creates friction, because your system has already withdrawn energy from that timeline. Neuroscience explains this clearly. Dopamine is not just the chemical of pleasure, it's the chemical of pursuit. When the brain no longer predicts reward from a certain future, dopamine stops firing toward it. This isn't laziness, it's prediction updating. Your nervous system no longer believes the old timeline leads anywhere worth going, so it stops responding. Spiritually, this is the moment people describe as feeling in between worlds. You're not aligned with the past, but you're not yet embodied in the future. Identity loosens. Familiar narratives lose their authority. You may feel strangely calm one moment and strangely disconnected the next. Not depressed, not excited, just suspended. This suspension is intentional. A timeline cannot fully release you until your attachment to it dissolves. Attachment doesn't disappear through logic. It disappears through neutrality. When the emotional charge fades, the bond breaks naturally. That's why this phase feels quiet rather than dramatic. You're not being pushed out. You're being gently unhooked. This is also why many people misinterpret this phase as losing passion or losing themselves. In reality, you're losing identification with a version of yourself that was calibrated for a different timeline. The future self you're moving toward doesn't need the same emotional fuel, so the system stops producing it. If you pay attention, you may notice that even problems feel different now. Issues still exist, but they don't dominate your internal space. You handle them, but they don't define you. This is one of the clearest signs that the old timeline no longer has jurisdiction over your nervous system. The danger here is not stagnation. The danger is interference. Interference happens when the mind tries to reattach to the old timeline out of fear, when it insists on recreating urgency, forcing clarity, or manufacturing purpose prematurely. This pulls the system back into oscillation and delays the shift. The field doesn't punish this. It simply waits. It waits until the observer stops looking backward for confirmation and forward for reassurance. It waits until presence becomes stable. That's when the new timeline can begin responding without distortion. And this is why this phase feels invisible to others. There's nothing to show yet. No external proof. No obvious movement. Just an internal quiet that feels unfamiliar if you've lived most of your life driven by tension. But this quiet is not emptiness. It's space. Space where a new identity can stabilize without being contaminated by old expectations. Space where the nervous system can reset its baseline. Space where perception sharpens because it's no longer drowned out by emotional noise. If you're here right now, you're not lost. You're unassigned. And unassignment is the final requirement before reassignment. In the next part, we'll talk about why you don't manifest a new timeline at this stage. You tune into it. And why effort actually blocks the transition once disengagement has begun. At this stage, one misunderstanding can quietly pull you back into the old timeline if you're not aware of it. The belief that you now need to do something to create the new reality, to visualize harder, to plan more carefully, to force clarity into place. But the truth is, timelines are not built through effort. They are accessed through resonance. You don't manifest a timeline, you tune into it. The quantum field does not respond to desire alone. Desire is mental. The field responds to coherence, the alignment between your internal state and the reality you're capable of sustaining. When coherence is present, the transition feels natural. When it's absent, manifestation feels like struggle. This is why forcing intention during a timeline shift creates resistance. Effort belongs to linear creation. Tuning belongs to quantum access. Think of it like a radio frequency. You don't build the station you want to hear. You adjust the receiver until the signal becomes clear. Pushing the dial harder doesn't improve reception. Precision does. Stillness does. Allowing the noise to drop does. That's what's happening internally right now. Your system is no longer meant to chase outcomes. It's meant to stabilize frequency. And frequency is shaped by what feels natural to you, not by what you convince yourself to want. From a neurological standpoint, this is crucial. When you attempt to force a future while your nervous system is still integrating a new baseline, you reactivate old stress circuits. The body interprets force as threat. Threat pulls you back into survival patterns. Survival patterns anchor you to the old timeline. So the very act of trying to manifest too early becomes the thing that delays the shift. Spiritually, this is where many people confuse surrender with passivity. Surrender does not mean doing nothing. It means no longer interfering with what is already aligning. It means trusting the intelligence of the process instead of trying to manage it. Neville Goddard spoke about living from the end, but what's often missed is that the end must feel normal. Effortful imagination still signals lack. Coherent embodiment signals readiness. If you notice that forcing vision feels exhausting right now, that's not resistance. That's feedback. Your system is telling you that the signal is already adjusting, and too much mental input creates static. This is also why the most powerful shifts happen when people stop talking about them. Language freezes identity. Silence allows identity to reorganize. When you stop explaining who you are becoming, you give the system room to complete the transition without interference. You may notice that your intuition feels sharper now, but quieter, less dramatic, more matter-of-fact. That's tuning. Intuition doesn't shout when coherence is present. It guides subtly because there's no internal conflict competing with it. This is the phase where alignment stops being emotional and starts being practical. Decisions simplify. You know what not to do without overthinking it. You don't need to weigh every option. Certain paths simply don't register anymore. That's not indecision, that's frequency selection. The old timeline required motivation, validation, and emotional charge to keep you moving. The new one doesn't. It responds to presence, to consistency, to a nervous system that isn't seeking relief through outcomes. And this is why tuning feels anticlimactic at first. There's no rush, no fireworks, just a sense that you're no longer fighting reality. You're listening to it. If you're here right now, the work is not to visualize a better future. It's to remain coherent in the present, to notice when you're tempted to force clarity, to allow silence to do what effort never could. Because once tuning is complete, manifestation doesn't feel like creation. It feels like recognition. You recognize opportunities that were always there but never visible through the noise. You recognize timing without anxiety. You recognize movement without urgency. And that's when the new timeline begins responding, not because you demanded it, but because you finally matched it. If this resonates, anchor the awareness by commenting, "I trust the shift." In the next part, we'll talk about what it actually means to leave a timeline behind, the subtle grief, the identity release, and why letting go feels heavier right before freedom becomes permanent. Leaving a timeline behind is rarely dramatic. It doesn't look like closure, certainty, or immediate relief. Most of the time, it feels like a quiet grief you can't fully explain. Not grief for something you lost, but grief for a version of yourself that no longer fits anywhere you're going. This is the part people aren't warned about. When a timeline dissolves, it takes identities with it, old motivations, old coping mechanisms, old ways of proving your worth or feeling safe. And even if those versions of you were heavy, they were familiar. Familiarity creates attachment, even to struggle. That's why letting go feels heavier right before it becomes freeing. From a quantum perspective, identity is not fixed. It's a pattern of coherence between memory, emotion, and expectation. When a timeline shift begins, that pattern destabilizes. The mind tries to reconstruct it quickly because the absence of identity feels like danger. But reconstruction too early locks you back into the old frequency. So the field creates space instead. This space can feel uncomfortable because it's undefined. You're no longer the person who needed to hustle to survive, but you're not yet the person who moves with ease. You're no longer driven by fear, but you're not yet driven by clarity. You're between identities. That in-between state is not a mistake, it's a requirement. Neuroscience explains this as identity plasticity. When old neural narratives weaken, the brain enters a phase where it is more open to new self-models. But during this phase, motivation drops temporarily. The system reduces output so it can reorganize internally without overload. This is why trying to reinvent yourself too fast feels wrong. Reinvention implies construction. What's happening now is dissolution. Spiritually, this is the phase where attachment reveals itself most clearly. Not attachment to things, but attachment to being someone, to being the fixer, the struggler, the one who holds everything together, the one who survives instead of receives. Those identities carried you through earlier timelines, but they can't come forward unchanged. The grief you may feel now is not about loss of opportunity. It's about releasing the role you played to earn safety. And that role often feels like who you are, even when it is. This is why the field doesn't rush this phase. If you skip the grief, you carry the old identity forward unconsciously, and then the new timeline has to respond to mixed signals. Expansion arrives, but the nervous system treats it like a threat. So the letting go must complete. You may notice moments where you miss parts of yourself you know you can't return to, ways you used to push, ways you used to cope, ways you used to feel alive through tension. Missing them doesn't mean you should go back. It means the attachment is dissolving. This is also where silence becomes important. Talking too much about who you're becoming can freeze the process. Explaining creates definitions. Definitions anchor identity prematurely. The field responds best when identity is still fluid. You're not meant to declare your next version yet. You're meant to allow it to stabilize. Leaving a timeline behind doesn't require dramatic decisions. It happens when your emotional system stops responding to old triggers, when old fears no longer motivate you, when old rewards no longer satisfy you. That's when the bond breaks. And when the bond breaks, the timeline releases you naturally. No forcing, no resistance, no final confrontation required. This is why people often look back later and say, "I don't know when it changed." Because the change wasn't an event. It was a gradual disengagement that completed quietly. If you're feeling a strange mix of calm and sadness right now, that's not confusion. That's integration. You're closing a chapter without needing to relive it one last time. And once this release completes, something else happens. The need to mourn disappears, not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer defines you. In the next and final part, we'll talk about how to stabilize the new timeline once it begins responding, and how to move forward without dragging the old self into a reality it was never designed to live in. When a new timeline finally begins to respond, it doesn't announce itself with fireworks.
There's no dramatic moment when everything suddenly clicks. Change begins more subtly than that. You start noticing that life no longer pushes back the way it used to. Decisions land with ease. Timing feels natural. You stop negotiating with reality, and reality stops resisting you. This is what stabilization feels like. A timeline doesn't become real the moment you enter it. It becomes real when you stop slipping out of it. Slipping only happens when fragments of the old identity are still trying to survive inside the new frequency. That's why stability matters more than speed. A fast shift without stability collapses. A stable shift, however, compounds from a quantum perspective. This is the moment when probability locks in. The observer no longer oscillates between multiple emotional states, so reality no longer needs to mirror contradiction. The signal becomes consistent, and consistency allows outcomes to repeat effortlessly. Neuroscience mirrors this perfectly. When a new identity stabilizes, the brain stops scanning for danger or unfamiliar success. Stress hormones drop. Decision-making becomes efficient. You no longer need to convince yourself that things are safe. Your body already knows. That's why the most important work now is integration, not expansion. Integration looks like simplicity. You stop overloading your life with too many intentions. You don't rush to define the future. You let patterns form naturally, giving your nervous system space to trust the new baseline instead of constantly testing it. This is also where patience becomes a form of intelligence, not passive waiting, but active restraint. You notice impulses to rush, to prove, to lock things in prematurely, and you let them pass. Every time you do, the new timeline stabilizes a little more. Spiritually, this is what it means to walk in faith without seeking reassurance. You no longer ask for signs, because the absence of resistance becomes the sign. You don't need constant confirmation you're on the right path. The path feels quiet internally. The old timeline required effort to maintain. The new one requires presence, and presence isn't something you perform, it's something you protect. As you move forward, the invitation is simple. Don't reintroduce struggle where it no longer belongs. Don't romanticize pressure. Don't confuse intensity with progress. The timeline you're stabilizing responds to steadiness, not force. This is why 2026 won't feel like a beginning in the traditional sense. It will feel like continuation without friction, like stepping into a room you've already been preparing to enter, like remembering something you didn't realize you knew. If uncertainty arises, return to the body. If it feels calm, grounded, and open, the timeline is holding. If tension returns, take it as information, not failure. Adjust gently, don't dramatize it. For those who feel called to anchor this shift more intentionally, Quantum Rebirth offers a framework for integration, not to manifest faster, but to release what can't come forward. Alongside it, the Quantum Grimoire is a practical companion, helping you observe patterns, track coherence, and remain grounded as the new timeline stabilizes. Both are available in the pinned comment whenever it feels aligned. You're not starting over, you're not behind, you're not late, you're standing in a timeline that has already begun responding to you. The only thing left is to trust the shift and allow it to finish what it started.